Barron Trump walked into a McDonald's on a regular afternoon, expecting nothing more than a quick bite to eat. At 6'7", he naturally stood out in any crowd, but today, all eyes were on him for a different reason. The son of former President Donald Trump was used to attention, but what happened next was something he never saw coming. As he stepped up to the counter, he was met by a new face, Ricardo, the newly promoted manager. A proud Spanish immigrant, Ricardo had worked his way up from the bottom, and he took pride in running his restaurant with discipline and fairness. But when he saw Barron standing there, something in his expression shifted. There was no admiration, no nervousness, just a firm, unreadable look. Barron placed his order, expecting the usual smooth transaction, but instead of the polite, efficient service he was used to, there was a long pause. Ricardo glanced at the teenage staff members, then back at Barron. The tension was subtle but undeniable. "I'm sorry," Ricardo finally said, his voice cool and measured, "but we can't serve you today." A murmur spread through the customers waiting in line. Some pulled out their phones, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Barron frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone still calm but laced with disbelief. Ricardo didn't waver. "Company policy," he said, but there was something deeper in his voice, a personal edge. The workers behind the counter exchanged glances, and the air felt thick with an unspoken history. For the first time in his life, Barron found himself on the receiving end of an unexpected humiliation. He had never been turned away like this before, and he certainly hadn't expected it over a simple burger and fries. People whispered, phones recorded, and the moment stretched on, growing heavier by the second. But just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, karma had its own plans. Because in a twist no one saw coming, something happened that changed everything. Barron's confusion deepened as he looked around. Whispers turned into hushed conversations, and more phones went up, capturing the unexpected moment. He wasn't sure if he should walk away or press for an explanation. His upbringing had taught him to remain composed in public, but right now he was at a loss. Ricardo stood firm, his hands resting on the counter, his expression unreadable. The other employees seemed tense, avoiding eye contact with both Barron and their manager. It was clear that whatever was happening wasn't just about McDonald's policy, there was something else at play. Barron glanced at the menu screen above, stalling for time. He wasn't used to this kind of rejection. People usually treated him with a level of deference, whether because of his family name or his towering presence. But Ricardo didn't seem impressed by either. Instead, he looked like someone who had waited a long time for this moment. A woman standing nearby, holding a tray, leaned toward Barron. "Are they seriously not serving you?" she whispered, her eyes wide with curiosity. A few other customers nodded, their curiosity turning into concern. Barron's presence had turned what should have been a routine order into something far more dramatic. Ricardo finally spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't personal," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But sometimes things come full circle." Barron furrowed his brow. "I don't understand," he said, his voice calm but edged with frustration. Ricardo tilted his head slightly, as if debating how much to say. "Let's just say, not everyone forgets," he replied cryptically. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Barron felt a shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger, something he hadn't been aware of. He had walked in expecting a simple meal, but now he found himself at the center of a standoff he didn't fully understand. And as the tension thickened, it became clear that whatever was happening wasn't over yet. Barron's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. He was no stranger to tense situations, but this felt different. There was a weight to Ricardo's words, something deeper than just a denied order. People were watching, waiting for his reaction, but he wasn't sure how to respond. A younger employee behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ricardo before finally speaking up. Sir, maybe we should just take his order." His voice was hesitant, Like he didn't want to challenge his boss, but also didn't understand why things had escalated. Ricardo didn't look at the employee. His eyes stayed locked on Barron. "I said what I said." His voice was steady, unwavering. Barron exhaled slowly, his frustration barely showing, but inside, he was piecing things together. This wasn't about him personally, at least, not in the way he first thought. Ricardo's reaction came from something else, something bigger than just a random customer at McDonald's. But what? The tension in the restaurant had turned thick, and then finally someone else broke the silence. "You really think this is the right way to handle this?" The voice was deep, calm, and came from an older man sitting in the corner. His salt and pepper hair and weathered hands suggested he had seen a lot in his time. He wasn't filming like the others, he was simply watching. Ricardo turned slightly, his jaw tightening. "It's not about what's right or wrong. It's about remembering," he said. Barron's mind raced. Remembering? Did this have something to do with his father, with politics? He knew people had strong feelings about his family, but he had always been more of an observer in those matters, not the target. Ricardo's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something personal, something unresolved. And then, without explaining further, he turned and disappeared into the back of the restaurant, leaving Barron standing at the counter, still without answers. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a random act. There was a history here, and Barron was now in the middle of it, whether he wanted to be or not. Barron stood frozen at the counter, his mind racing. The low murmur of the restaurant buzzed around him, but all he could focus on was the unsettling way Ricardo had walked off without another word. The way he had said, "It's about remembering." Remembering what? The older man in the corner, the one who had spoken up earlier, leaned back in his chair, watching Barron carefully. He didn't have his phone out like the others. He wasn't here for a viral moment. It was almost like he had expected something like this to happen. Barron turned slightly toward him. "Do you know what this is about?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The man hesitated, then finally said, "It's not my place to explain, kid. But let's just say, some people don't forget where they came from." The words hit Barron in a strange way. He had always been aware of how people viewed his last name, how his father's reputation could turn a simple interaction into something much bigger. But this felt personal. He wasn't sure why Ricardo had chosen this moment, this place, to make a statement. A tense silence stretched between them before a loud voice suddenly cut through the room. "Hey, what's going on here?" A shift manager, a woman with her hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, had come out from the back, clearly confused. She looked from Barron to the customers still filming, to the employees standing stiffly behind the counter. Why is everyone just standing around? The young worker who had tried to take Barron's order earlier hesitated before speaking. Ricardo refused to serve him. The woman's brows furrowed. What? Why? No one answered. The employees glanced at each other, unsure. The tension had been so thick that even they didn't fully understand what was happening. Before anyone could respond, a door swung open and Ricardo returned. But this time he wasn't alone. A man in his late 50s followed him out, his face lined with years of hard work. His uniform was faded but neatly pressed, and there was something familiar about the way he carried himself, strong, steady, like someone who had faced battles of his own. Barron didn't recognize him, but the moment their eyes met, he felt it. This wasn't random. This was personal. The room went silent as the man crossed his arms and let out a slow breath. Then finally he spoke. "You don't know me, but I know your family." The weight of those words hung in the air. Barron's stomach tightened. Whatever this was, it was about to reach its breaking point. Barron's pulse quickened as he studied the man standing in front of him. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes held an intensity that made it clear. This wasn't just some ordinary encounter. This man had been waiting for this moment. The restaurant was dead silent now. Even the people who had been recording lowered their phones slightly, sensing that something much bigger was unfolding. The shift manager, still standing nearby, looked as confused as anyone else. Barron straightened his posture, keeping his voice even. "I don't understand. Who are you?" The man exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Manuel Torres. Years ago, my brother worked construction. He was on a job site, one of the many projects under your father's name." He paused, his jaw tightening for a split second before he continued. He was promised fair pay. But when the work was done, the money never came. My brother kept waiting, kept asking, but he never saw a dime. Barron felt a shift in the air. The name, the story, it was all unfamiliar to him. But the way Manuel spoke, the years of frustration layered in his voice, told him this was real. This was something that had haunted this man and his family for a long time. Ricardo, still standing beside Manuel, crossed his arms. "You don't think people remember?" he said quietly. "You don't think those choices have consequences?" Barron opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the front door swung open with a sharp chime. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, scanning the room quickly before locking eyes on Barron. It was one of his security detail, someone assigned to keep an eye on him in public places. He moved toward Barron with purpose. "Everything okay here?" His voice was firm but calm, clearly assessing the tension in the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Barron felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. He wasn't sure what he was even supposed to feel. But before he could answer, Manuel took a step forward. "You can leave," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "But just know, some debts don't disappear. Some things don't just get forgotten." Barron wasn't sure if it was a warning or something else. But as he stood there, the realization hit him. This wasn't just about a meal. This was about history catching up, and it wasn't over yet. Barron felt the weight of Manuel's words settle over him. The room was still tense, every person inside waiting to see what he would do. The security guard at his side was ready to intervene if needed, but Barron wasn't sure if that would make things better or worse. He looked back at Manuel, at the years of frustration etched into his face. This wasn't just about him standing in a McDonald's. This was about something much deeper, something he had no control over, but was now forced to confront. He knew he couldn't fix the past, but he also couldn't walk away without saying something. "I didn't know about your brother," Barron said finally, his voice steady but quieter than before. "I had nothing to do with that." Manuel let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. "I know," he admitted. "You were just a kid." But then his expression hardened again. "But that doesn't mean it didn't happen." Barron didn't flinch. He had spent his entire life under a microscope. But this was different. This wasn't political. This was personal. The security guard took a step forward. "I think it's time to go," he said firmly. Barron hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. Without another word, he turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, Manuel spoke again. "Wait." Barron stopped, glancing back. Manuel reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He held it up for a moment before stepping forward and pressing it into Barron's hand. Barron unfolded it carefully. It was old, the edges worn, but the words were clear. An invoice, a payment never made. Proof. "You can't change the past," Manuel said, his voice softer now. "But you can choose what you do with the truth." Barron looked down at the paper, then back up at the man who had spent years holding on to it. He didn't know what he was supposed to do with this. But one thing was certain, he wasn't leaving this McDonald's the same person who walked in. And as he stepped outside, the camera still rolling, he realized the real story had only just begun. Barron stepped outside, the cool air hitting his face as he gripped the old invoice in his hand. The weight of the moment still pressed down on him. He had walked into that McDonald's expecting nothing more than a meal, but he was leaving with something much heavier, a glimpse into a past he had never been a part of, yet somehow it still followed him. His security detail stayed close, but for once, Barron barely noticed. He turned the paper over in his hands, scanning the faded words, the numbers that had never been paid. He didn't know what to feel. Guilt, responsibility. None of this had been his doing, but it was his name tied to it. Inside the restaurant, the tension had started to settle. The customers slowly went back to their meals, and the employees whispered amongst themselves, processing everything that had just happened. Manuel sat back down, his expression unreadable, while Ricardo stood near the counter, his arms still crossed, watching Barron through the window. Barron knew he could throw the paper away, walk away, pretend this never happened. That would be the easy thing to do. But something told him this wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle, about acknowledging what had been ignored for too long. He took a deep breath, then slid the paper into his pocket. Maybe he couldn't change the past, but that didn't mean he had to ignore it. Without saying anything else, he stepped toward the black SUV waiting for him at the curb. As he climbed in and shut the door, his reflection stared back at him through the tinted glass. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just Barron Trump, the son of a powerful man. He was his own person, standing at a crossroads only he could navigate. As the car pulled away, he glanced down at the paper one last time. He didn't know what he was going to do with it yet, but one thing was certain: this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a choice that was now his to make.